two siblings picking apples in their family's rural orchard vanished, without a trace one quiet autumn afternoon in 2013. Police claimed they must have wandered into nearby woods and gotten lost, a tragic but simple explanation. But no footprints ever led out of the orchard. No clothes, no remains, no calls for help. Then 6 years later, new farmers clearing the land noticed something disturbing. Strange, deliberate marks carved high into the oldest apple tree marks that hadn't been there before. And once investigators measured them, they realized the carvings were made years after the children disappeared, forcing a chilling question. Who was still coming back to this tree? The orchard had always been the quietest place in town, the kind of quiet that felt protective, almost holy. Rows of apple trees stretched across the gentle slope behind the farmhouse, their branches heavy with late September fruit, leaves whispering softly in the breeze. This was where nothing bad ever happened. And that was precisely why no one thought twice when the siblings walked into it that afternoon. Evan was 10, old enough to feel responsible, young enough to still believe the world followed rules. His sister Lily, 8, skipped beside him with a woven basket bumping against her knees, already humming a tune she made up as she went. Their mother watched them from the back porch, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. "Stay where I can see you," she called out, more habit than worry. "We will," Evan replied, without turning around. They'd picked apples here 100 times before. Their grandfather had planted most of the trees decades earlier, back when the land felt endless and the town felt permanent. Every family gathering ended with someone wandering the orchard, brushing fingers along bark carved with old initials, lifting fallen apples from the grass. For Evan and Lily, the orchard wasn't wilderness, it was memory. As they stepped between the first rows, the sounds of the house faded. No traffic. No voices. Just wind moving through leaves and the dull thud of apples dropping somewhere deeper in the grove. Lily darted ahead, stopping to examine a tree with fruit so red it looked painted. "These ones are the best," she said. Evan nodded, already reaching up. He twisted an apple free and dropped it into the basket. It landed gently, joining the others like it belonged there. They moved slowly, methodically, the way their father had taught them, never pulling too hard, never rushing. Time seemed to stretch in the orchard, minutes dissolving into the rhythm of picking and choosing. At one point, Lily wandered a little farther than usual, disappearing behind a thicker cluster of trees. "Don't go too far," Evan said, a note of warning in his voice. "I can still see you," she replied, laughing. But the orchard had a way of bending sightlines. One step to the left, one trunk too wide, and people vanished from view, not gone, just hidden. Evan hesitated, then followed, his shoes crunching softly over fallen leaves. They didn't notice the air grow cooler, or how the wind seemed to die the deeper they went. They didn't notice that the birds had gone quiet. What they did notice was a tree they didn't usually come to: older, thicker, its bark dark and rough compared to the others. Its branches stretched higher, tangled in a way that made the apples harder to reach. "Bet there's good ones up there," Lily said. Evan stepped closer, craning his neck. The trunk was scarred with old knots and natural grooves. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just another tree. Just another moment. Somewhere back at the house, their mother glanced at the clock. 10 minutes had passed. Then 20. She told herself not to worry. Kids lost track of time. Apples took longer to pick than you expected. But when she called their names, the orchard did not answer. By the time she stepped off the porch and into the first row of trees, the sun had dipped just enough to cast long shadows between the trunks. The baskets sat where they'd been dropped, apples still inside, untouched, and Evan and Lily were nowhere in sight. By the time panic arrived, it did so quietly, slipping in behind denial, pretending to be patience. Their mother walked deeper into the orchard, calling their names with the same calm tone she'd used 100 times before. "Evan? Lily?" Her voice moved between the rows and came back thinner, swallowed by leaves and bark. She told herself they were crouched somewhere, comparing apples, laughing at a private joke. Then she saw the baskets. One sat upright beneath a tree, apples neatly stacked inside, untouched. The other lay on its side nearby, fruit spilled into the grass as if dropped mid-motion. No footprints ran from them. No broken branches. Just absence. Her voice changed when she shouted next, sharper, louder, edged with something she didn't recognize yet. Fear. Neighbors arrived first, drawn by the sound. Then their father, abandoning his truck in the drive, running full speed into the orchard as if momentum alone could undo what was happening. Within minutes, the rows were filled with adults, shouting names, scanning the ground, retracing paths the children always took. "Check the fence line," someone said. "They wouldn't go past the creek," another insisted. Police arrived less than an hour later. They walked the orchard slowly, deliberately, as if speed might cause them to miss something obvious. Flashlights came out even though there was still daylight, beams cutting through shadowed spaces between trunks. That was when the first official theory formed. "Kids wander," one officer said gently. "Happens faster than you think." But wandering left signs, shoe prints, bent grass, something. Search dogs were brought in before sunset. The handler knelt beside the overturned basket, letting the dog catch the scent. The animal moved quickly at first, tail stiff, nose low, then slowed, then stopped, right at the base of the old tree. The handler frowned, tugged lightly at the leash, urging the dog forward. The animal circled once, whined softly, then sat down. "That's it," the handler said. "Scent ends here." Officers marked the spot with tape. Flashlights climbed the trunk, tracing its grooves and knots, searching branches above. Nothing. No torn clothing. No scrape marks. Just bark and apples hanging undisturbed. As night fell, the orchard transformed. Floodlights were set up, casting harsh white illumination that flattened the rows into stark corridors. The familiar land became unfamiliar shadows, sharper, distances distorted. Volunteers formed lines, calling out every few steps, their voices overlapping in desperate rhythm. "Evan! Lily! Can you hear us?" The woods beyond the orchard were searched next, dense, uneven, full of places a child could stumble or hide. But even there, nothing surfaced. No crying, no movement, no evidence they had ever crossed that boundary. By midnight, frustration replaced panic. "How can two kids just disappear?" a neighbor whispered. "They were right here," their father kept saying, pointing again and again at the tree. "Right here." Investigators suggested exhaustion, disorientation, fear. Maybe they'd circled back. Maybe they were curled up somewhere, asleep. The words sounded reasonable until you looked at the map. The orchard was only a few acres. You could walk its perimeter in minutes. And by morning, every inch of it had been walked. Twice, when dawn came, it brought clarity and something worse. In daylight, it was impossible to ignore how contained the area really was. No roads nearby, no abandoned structures, no ravines deep enough to swallow sound. And still, there were no footprints leading out. The ground was soft enough to hold impressions. It should have recorded their exit. It didn't. The lead investigator stood with hands on hips, staring at the tree where the scent had ended. "They didn't leave," he said quietly. "At least not on foot." That was when the orchard stopped feeling safe. That was when the possibility settled in heavy, unspoken, that whatever happened to Evan and Lily hadn't happened out there in the wild. It had happened here. And if that was true, then the orchard wasn't just the last place they were seen. It was the only place they'd ever been. By the third day, the orchard no longer sounded like a place of hope. Boots had crushed the grass flat. Bright tape fluttered from branches like warnings. The smell of diesel from generators mixed with fallen apples beginning to rot in the sun. What had once been familiar ground was now divided into grids, numbers, coordinates, a crime scene pretending to be a rescue. Search teams returned again and again to the same places, convinced that repetition would somehow produce new results. They walked slower now, eyes trained not just on the ground but on the spaces between things, hollows, shadows, gaps where light didn't reach. Helicopters swept overhead, their blades chopping the air into fragments, sending leaves spiraling across the rows. Still nothing. No footprints leading away. No signs of injury. No trace of Evan or Lily beyond the baskets and the tree. One volunteer stopped near the creek and shook his head. "If they'd come through here," he said, pointing to the muddy bank, "we'd see it, even barefoot." But the mud was smooth, untouched. The official explanation didn't change, just shifted tone. Where there had once been urgency, there was now cautious resignation. Officers began using phrases like low probability of survival and expanded search radius. The orchard was no longer the focus. Except for one person. Their father returned to the tree every morning before the search resumed. He stood there silently, hand pressed flat against the bark, eyes scanning upward as if expecting something to appear if he stared long enough. "They stopped here," he said to anyone who would listen. "They didn't leave. Something happened here." Detectives humored him at first, then gently redirected him. Trees didn't swallow children, orchards didn't hide secrets. The simplest explanation was still the most comfortable. They'd wandered farther than expected, panicked, and kept moving. But comfort wasn't evidence. On the fourth day, a small detail began to circulate quietly among volunteers. Someone mentioned that the apples in Lily's basket were all from the same tree, carefully chosen, not rushed. Another noted that Evan's shoe prints stopped suddenly, toes angled inward, as if he'd turned not to run, but to look at something. Investigators logged the observations, then filed them away. By the end of the week, the crowds thinned. Media trucks left. Posters went up on telephone poles instead. The orchard fell silent again, but it was a different silence now. Heavy. Expectant. Their mother refused to enter it. She sat at the kitchen table, each night, staring out the window at the dark rows beyond the yard light, replaying every moment she could remember. Had Lily complained of being tired? Had Evan asked to go somewhere else? She rewound the afternoon endlessly, convinced she'd missed the exact second everything went wrong. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams ended at the tree. When the official search was called off, the announcement landed like a betrayal. The words "no further leads" echoed through the house, hollow and cruel. But the family didn't stop looking. They walked the orchard themselves, slower than the professionals had, touching bark, lifting stones, listening. One evening, as the sun dipped low, their father noticed something that made his chest tighten. The orchard was wrong, not visibly, not dramatically. But the sounds, the insects that usually filled the air at dusk, were absent near the center rows. The farther he walked from the house, the quieter it became, until only his breathing remained. He stood beneath the old tree again, heart pounding, and felt it a pressure, a sense of being observed without seeing anyone there. "Evan?" he whispered. "Lily?" The orchard did not answer. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the ground, erasing what little evidence might have remained. By spring, hope had thinned to something fragile and private. The case was officially labeled cold. Eventually, the orchard was abandoned. The family couldn't bear to tend it anymore. Trees went unpruned. Apples fell and rotted where they landed. Nature began reclaiming the rows, growing wild and uneven, as if trying to hide what it knew. But the tree where the scent ended remained standing unchanged, unmarked, and waiting. And somewhere in that quiet, unanswered space, a question lingered. If nothing was found, why did it still feel like something had been left behind? Time did what the search could not. It buried the orchard, without ever resolving it. The seasons passed in cycles that felt almost mocking. Spring returned with blossoms the children never saw. Summers came heavy with fruit no one picked. Autumns dropped apples that split and browned in the grass, their sweetness wasted. And each winter, snow pressed the land flat, as if trying to smooth away the question that refused to disappear. 6 years went by. The house changed first. Toys were boxed up, then moved to the attic, then never touched again. Conversations learned to curve around two missing names. Birthdays became quiet days. Holidays felt incomplete in ways no one could quite explain to outsiders. But the orchard changed the most. Without care, the neat rows collapsed into chaos. Branches tangled, weeds swallowed the paths. Saplings grew where fallen apples had been left to rot, turning memory into something wild and unmanageable. From the road, it no longer looked like a place where children once laughed. It looked abandoned, and that, more than anything, felt wrong. Their parents argued about selling the land for years. "If we let it go," their mother said once, voice shaking. "It's like admitting they're not coming back." Their father stared out the window at the trees. "Or maybe it's admitting we can't live there anymore." When the sale finally happened, it was quiet. No announcement, no closure. Just signatures and keys passed across a desk. The orchard that had belonged to the family for generations now belonged to strangers. The official case remained unchanged. Files gathered dust. The conclusion, probable exposure after wandering away, sat unchallenged, despite the complete lack of physical proof. Investigators rotated out. New officers skimmed the report, frowned at the inconsistencies, then moved on. Still, theories lived on. Some locals whispered about animals, coyotes, feral dogs, but no blood was ever found. Others suggested an abduction, though there were no vehicles seen, no witnesses, no tire tracks. A sinkhole was proposed once, briefly, until geological surveys ruled it out. Every explanation failed the same test. None of them explained why the children vanished without leaving the orchard. The new farmers arrived in early spring, eager and practical. They planned to restore the land, bring the trees back into production. Overgrowth didn't scare them, it was just work. They walked the property with notebooks and maps, marking trees that needed cutting, sections that needed clearing. That was when they noticed the old one. It stood near the center of the orchard, larger than the rest, its trunk thicker, its branches reaching higher. Unlike many others, it was still healthy, stubbornly alive. The farmer paused, beneath it longer than expected, eyes narrowing. "Strange tree," he muttered. "What's strange about it?" his wife asked. "Nothing," he said after a moment. "Just feels like it shouldn't still be here." They left it standing. Weeks later, as clearing began in earnest, workers returned to that part of the orchard with ladders and chainsaws. And that was when one of them called out, his voice tight with confusion. "Hey," he said, "you should come see this." High up on the trunk well above where a child could reach were marks, not natural grooves, not animal scratches. Deliberate carvings. Deep, precise, weathered just enough to suggest age, but not enough to erase their shape. The farmer climbed the ladder slowly, running his fingers over the grooves. He didn't know why his hands were shaking. "These aren't old," he said. "At least, not that old." They took photos, measured the height, compared them to older images of the orchard found in public records. The tree had been unmarked 6 years earlier. Someone had come back. Someone had stood in the exact place where the children vanished years after they were gone and carved into the bark. And suddenly, the silence of the orchard didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. The call to police didn't come from fear at first, it came from confusion. The farmer stood beneath the tree with his phone pressed to his ear, staring upward as if the bark itself might explain what he was seeing. The carvings weren't random. That was the first thing that unsettled him. They weren't the shallow scratches of bored teenagers or the chaotic slashes of vandalism. Each mark was intentional, cut deep into the bark, spaced evenly, repeating a pattern that didn't belong to nature. When investigators arrived, they brought ladders, measuring tools, and a skepticism sharpened by years of false leads. "This tree's been here a long time," one officer said. "Could be old damage." But then they measured. The lowest mark sat nearly 6 feet off the ground. The highest reached closer to 8. Too high for a child, too deliberate to be accidental. And when they compared the angles, the pressure patterns, the depth of the grooves, a quiet consensus formed. These were made by an adult. Photos from 6 years earlier were pulled from archived records, aerial shots, family pictures taken during holidays, even an old real estate listing. The bark in those images was clean, unbroken. The carvings came later. A forensic botanist was brought in to estimate timing. He examined the healing around the cuts, the way the tree had grown over the edges. His conclusion landed with a dull finality. "Not recent," he said. "But not from before the disappearance either, somewhere in between." Years after Evan and Lily vanished, someone had returned to this exact tree. When the family was notified, the news hit harder than the original disappearance. Their mother didn't cry at first. She stared at the photos, fingers tracing the screen, as if touching the marks might transmit meaning. "Why here?" she asked quietly. "Why not anywhere else?" Their father said nothing. He only asked to see the tree. Standing beneath it again after all this time felt like reopening a wound that never healed. The orchard looked smaller now. Or maybe he was bigger. Either way, the distance that once felt safe now felt claustrophobic. "These weren't here," he said. "I would have seen them." Investigators walked him through their theories: memorial carving, trespassers, prank. But none of them fully explained the pattern. The marks weren't names. They weren't symbols anyone could identify. Just vertical lines intersected by shallow crosscuts, repeated 3 times around the trunk, as if meant to be seen from any angle. "Could be counting," one detective suggested under his breath. Counting what? He didn't say. The case was quietly reopened. Old officers were contacted. Files dusted off. Questions re-asked that had once been dismissed too quickly. Who had access to the land after it was abandoned? Who knew the orchard well enough to come back to that exact spot? One unsettling detail surfaced almost immediately. The property hadn't been empty the entire 6 years. Teenagers had partied there occasionally. Hunters passed through in fall. And only once a nearby neighbor had reported seeing a light in the orchard late at night, years after the disappearance. "At the time, I thought it was kids messing around," the neighbor said. "Didn't think it was worth mentioning." The light had been near the center rows, near the tree. Investigators returned again after dark, recreating the conditions. Standing there, flashlights off, the orchard swallowed sound completely. Even whispered voices felt too loud. One officer climbed the ladder again, shining his light across the carvings. "That's not a message to the world," he said. "That's a message to someone who already knows." The idea settled uncomfortably among them. These marks weren't made to be found. They were made to be remembered. As the investigation stalled once more, the farmers asked if they could remove the tree. Cut it down, finish clearing the land. The answer came quickly. No, not yet. Because now the tree wasn't just a tree. It was evidence. And until someone could explain why a person would return to the exact point where 2 children vanished years later, under cover of darkness the orchard would remain frozen in time. The bark continued to heal. The marks slowly softened, but whatever carved them had already left what it needed behind. The tree was never cut down. Even after the investigation slowed, even after officers stopped visiting regularly, no one touched it. Workers cleared around it instead, leaving a wide circle of untouched ground as if the land itself had drawn a boundary. The orchard began to take shape again, but that tree remained solitary, marked, and quietly defiant. People in town noticed. They asked questions. The farmers didn't know how to answer. Some stopped walking their dogs near the property. Others drove past slower than necessary, eyes flicking toward the center rows. The orchard had become something else, now not a place, but a reminder. Investigators debated the carvings late into the reopened case. Every theory felt incomplete. A memorial didn't fit, no names, no dates, no grief etched into the bark. A prank didn't fit either, too deliberate, too isolated, too risky. Ritual markings were considered briefly, and dismissed just as quickly. There was no known symbolism that matched the pattern, which left one possibility no one liked saying out loud. Someone connected to the disappearance had come back. Maybe to remember, maybe to mark time, maybe to make sure nothing had changed. The idea that someone could stand in the exact place where Evan and Lily vanished years later, unnoticed, reframed everything. It suggested patience, familiarity, control. Their father visited once more before the land was fully restored. He stood beneath the tree at dusk, the same way he had years earlier, and looked up at the carvings. In the fading light, the grooves cast long shadows that seemed deeper than they really were. "They're not random," he said softly to the detective beside him. "They're placed, like someone wanted the tree to remember." The detective didn't argue. Records were checked again. Property access logs. Old tips reread. That neighbor's memory of a light in the orchard was expanded, dissected, retimed. It still led nowhere solid. Whoever had been there hadn't wanted to be seen and hadn't been. Eventually, the case slipped back into quiet suspension. Not closed, just unresolved. The kind of file that sat heavy in a cabinet, too unsettling to discard. The family never returned after that last visit. Seeing the marks had answered one question and created dozens more. The orchard was no longer a place where their children had vanished. It was a place where someone had returned. Years later, a storm split part of the tree's upper canopy. Branches fell, but the trunk held. The carvings remained, scarred deeper now as the bark grew around them, preserving their shape instead of erasing it. Locals say the farmers won't work that section after dark. They say animals avoid it. They say the air feels heavier there, especially at night, when the wind dies and sound seems to stop short of the trunk. Officially, nothing still comes back to the orchard, but the marks remain, cut by human hands, made years too late, placed too deliberately to mean nothing. And as long as that tree stands marked, measured, and unanswered, the question it raises refuses to fade. If Evan and Lily truly wandered away, why did someone feel the need to return?